I am Maria Sen. I'm the Advocacy Officer for the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa. I would like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar, which is commemorating the World Day Against Child Labor. Today's webinar is convened under the theme Child Labor and Business Accountability in Africa, Strengthening Corporate Responsibility for the Protection of Children's Rights. We are delighted to have you with us and look forward to a rich and engaging discussion. To formally welcome participants and deliver the opening remarks, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Michael Gianniaco, who happens to be the Deputy Executive Director of IHRDA. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good day, colleagues. A warm welcome to all of you to this webinar. We are grateful for your presence. Just to start us off, World Child Labor Day has been commemorated by the International Labour Organization since 2002 on the 12th of June every year to reinvigorate efforts to ensure that children across the globe are protected from harmful labor practices and that they are able to enjoy their childhood to the best possible ways. This year in March, the sixth conference was held in Marrakesh. The sixth Global Conference on Elimination of Child Labor was held in Marrakesh, which reaffirmed the need to accelerate progress and turn in the commitments that states across the globe have made into concrete results. This webinar seeks to contribute to that effort. In Africa, we know that this is an urgent issue for us, especially because we have a very young population. It is estimated that about half of Africa's population are children beyond the age of 18 years old, which means that there is a significant part of our population that is exposed to the risk of child labor, especially within the current socio-economic context that many of our countries are faced with. This webinar in particular tries to explore how exactly businesses, as important agents of society, may play a role in protecting children against child labor. We know that businesses provide employment opportunities, are important members of the society that, in many of our countries contribute significantly to the economy, but they may also have significant impact on the rights of children when they engage in exploitative hiring practices that have impacts on children's rights. So essentially what this webinar tries to do is to raise awareness about the implications of child labor on children and their communities. We know that child labor has significant personal and moral implications for children, but also may impact their socioeconomic rights, including being deprived from education because they are spending the time that they are supposed to be in school, working to earn a living to support themselves, oftentimes also to support their families. This morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, we will be examining the relationship between child labor, business practices, and corporate supply chains in Africa, with the aim of exploring exactly the obligations and responsibilities of states and business actors towards preventing and addressing child labor on the continent. Through these discussions with our eminent panel, who will be introduced to you shortly, we want to discuss the legal, policy, and accountability frameworks that are relevant to businesses and human rights obligations that seeks to protect children, and also to identify some of the practical strategies that may be deployed to strengthen corporate responsibility, due diligence, accountability mechanisms to protect children, exploring also how the regional human rights mechanisms may contribute towards protecting children and guiding both state parties and businesses towards responsible practices and accountability that protects children. So with those brief remarks, colleagues, we welcome you to this webinar. We have an eminent panel that would thoroughly use. We hope that this would be an informative webinar that you would join all of us in raising awareness about children, their rights, how they may be impacted by business activity, and how together as a society we may contribute towards ensuring that they are protected from harmful business conduct, but also holding businesses accountable when they infringe on children's rights to be protected from harmful labor practices. Colleagues, welcome to all of you, and I wish all of us a fruitful deliberation this afternoon. Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for those insightful opening remarks and for setting the context for today's discussion. And we will now proceed to the keynote presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Abe, Dr. Abe rather, who happens to be a distinguished scholar and practitioner in the field of business and human rights with expertise in corporate accountability, sustainability, human rights due diligence, and responsible business conduct. He has also collaborated with IHRDA on research relating to the mainstreaming of children's rights in national action plans and business and human rights in Africa. Today, Dr. Abe will deliver the keynote presentation on child labor and business accountability in Africa, the emerging threats, risks and challenges. Mr. Abe, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Maria. Am I able to share my screen?
Sure, you can.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Yeah. Okay, good. You can hear me well. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank the directors, executive directors, or the directorate of the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa, IHRDA, and Maria, of course, and her team for the kind invitation to be part of these very important discussions that we're going to be having. As Maria mentioned, the more like an introduction to the conversations we're going to be having later on today is focused on child labor and business accountability in Africa, and how we can imagine trends and how we can strengthen corporate responsibility for the protection of children's rights. There is no other more important day to have this conversation other than today, which is the World Day Against Child Labor, which provides an important moment for us to reflect on what has been achieved and what remains to be done. So I'm going to be a little bit biased. My remarks will draw on research, I think, as Maria mentioned, and the collaborative work which we've done with IHRDA on mainstreaming children's rights in national action plans on business and human rights in Africa. And from the lessons learned from their research, and of course what it's contemporary, the conversations will be get around the results from that research. So my keynote is framed around the notion that child labor is not a marginal compliance issue. It is a structural human rights issue with a corporate accountability dimension that international law is still struggling to address adequately. And why did I say that? The reason why I say that is if we pick up business and human rights frameworks, be it the UNGPs especially, which is the foundational piece of document, children's rights is rarely mentioned. In the ongoing negotiations towards the binding treaty on business and human rights, child rights is rarely mentioned. And this is mind-boggling. So we're going to move from the scale of the problem through the normative landscape and to the corporate nexus, the accountability gaps, the due diligence frameworks, remedy, and then I'm going to offer some recommendations at the end of my remarks. So what is the scale of the crisis as we have currently in Africa today? The International Labour Organization conducted a very, very detailed research in 2022, and globally, they found that about 160 million plus children are involved in child labor. But in Africa, because in Africa, it was discovered that about 72 million children, approximately 72 million children in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the highest regionally. So if you pick up all the regions, all the continents, 6 continents globally, sub-Saharan Africa, carries the weight in terms of, children that are engaged in child labor. The sectors where there's a prevalence are in agriculture, in mining, and in the informal economy. About 70% child labor instances in these sectors. And what are the key drivers? Poverty and household economic vulnerability, weak enforcement of labor and child protection laws, informality in supply chains and extractive sectors, inadequate corporate due diligence and oversight. So let's pause here for a moment. Let's look at the 70% benchmark or the threshold, if I may use that word. This is a critical one. And it implicates agriculture, extractive, which are the main drivers of African economies. And the staggering part of this research, of this analysis, is even more cogent when we look at it in terms of that. A vast majority of the population, like Michael noted, a vast majority of African population consists significantly of children. Structural in the sense that the corporate purchasing practices, part of the drivers, there's weak labor inspection, there's a supply chain lack of transparency, and these are not abstract statistics. These are detailed research carried by the ILO. And when I speak about this, I look at broader discussions, right? Take, for example, the extractive industries, mining. The current, you probably may have heard, the current buzzword we have today is just transition, energy transition. Of course, we want a sustainable society. We want to be able to live in a world, we want our children, our children's children to be able to live in a world that is sustainable, that is green. And therefore, we want to do away with fossil fuels and then move towards energy and just transition. So in the process of carrying out, that just transition, how do we exacerbate existing injustice associated with non-renewables? Pick, for example, electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, of course, there's a sustainable means of transportation. But what are the resources that drive the production of those electric vehicles? If you look at the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where cobalt is being mined, children are used excessively. So yes, we want just transition. But what powers that just transition? Child labor, in a way. So are we really, really looking at it in terms of sustainable development when the supply chain itself is riddled with significant human rights violations, and most importantly, child labor? So businesses are not just passive bystanders. They actively benefit from environments where child labor risks go unasked. So what is this business connection, right? So the business connection which we see here is in terms of the costs, how they contribute, and how it is linked to what they do. And the UNGPs, United Nations Guiding Principles, which is like I said, which is the foundational document when we talk about business accountability for human rights. Pillar 2 talks about corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So businesses directly employs children, or they instruct their suppliers to use child labor, or in terms of contribution, whether businesses practices create pressure in terms of the cost, the speed, the volume that predictably lead suppliers to use child labor. And then how it is linked to it is linked to child labor through its value chain without directly causing or contributing it. And I want to note a particular case, which was a case which to me was quite significant, even though the result was not what was intended. It is Doe and Nestle. So basically, Doe and Nestle was a case about the plaintiffs were children who were used as when they were young in a cocoa plantation in Ivory Coast many years ago. So they brought a case against Nestle. The Nestle violated international laws against slavery, and therefore Nestle should pay. Now, it's a very huge case. It was brought about in the United States at the Ninth Circuit. Eventually went to the Supreme Court. But of course, we all know the United States Supreme Court approach towards corporate accountability, and the result was that Nestle was not liable simply because corporations are not subject of international law. But The Ninth Circuit, which was a court of appeal, the discussions, the decision which they read was what I actually picked on, which of course has no overriding precedent when the Supreme Court has already ruled. But the Court of Appeal noted Nestle's argument in that case was that we were not directly involved in what happened in Ivory Coast. We didn't know whether children was used. All we did was that we sourced for cocoa, which we used, of course, in producing chocolates in developed countries. Who, what, where, the kind of labor force that were used were the responsibility of Ivorians. So what it did was, what the argument was that they contracted with an organization, farmers in Ivory Coast. So the farmer organization in Ivory Coast ended up employing children. So we should not be responsible. If at all anybody should be responsible, it should be the Ivorian organization of farmers in Ivory Coast that should be responsible. And the Court of Appeal said that was such a myopic argument, right? A myopic argument that an organization as big as Nestle, which of course has an obligation to respect international law, even though it's not written, would be myopic and claim profit over human rights. And I found that very, very interesting in that particular case. So it is no longer corporations are no longer passive bystanders. They're instrumental towards realizing business respect for human rights, and in particular, children. And we have so many examples that we can, for purpose of time. We have the fast-moving, the fashion industry, global fashion brass sourcing cotton from West Africa, which is linked, of course, to child labor, tea issue in Kenya, and coffee in Ethiopia, how children are being implicated, where businesses predominantly are dominated in Western countries, source for the raw products without actually controlling the supply chain process. So we're going to move on. That's just providing a background about the crisis that we are in. And the question is whether there are rules or regulations that could potentially respond to this crisis. Are there existing rules? And if there are they enforced? And if they are not, what are we doing to ensure that there are rules that keep up with the monstrosity of these corporate entities? So there are quite a number of significant, obligations and standards, and I'm just going to run through them for the purposes of time. You probably are familiar with ILO C-138 and C-182, which talks about the minimum age, and Wasfund Conventions, which of course has a near universal African ratification, defined core binding state obligations on child labor. Ratification, even though it has near universal African ratification, what we are experiencing is that ratification has not translated into enforcement. So it's one thing to ratify, it's another thing to implement. Right. And again, we have the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, which is a normative instrument, which is voluntary, but which has even worked more significantly than even some hard laws. As I'm going to mention, and I think as we're going to discuss in the conversations, we have a lot of human rights due diligence. Countries are coming up with human rights due diligence laws because of the UNGPs, which is a soft law instrument. We also have the SDG 8.5, which talks about ending child labor on all forms last year, and then end forced labor by 2030. We have the African Child on Rights and Welfare of the Child, which of course prohibits economic exploitation in the strongest terms, and hazardous labor in the strongest regional terms. We also have the General Comment 16, which talks about state obligations regarding business impacts on children's rights and mandates child rights impact assessment. And of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which does not specifically mention, but infers an integration of frameworks with human rights dimensions, which create an opportunity for us to be able to embed child labor standards in Africa trade obligations. At the regional level, we have the ECOWAS Regional action plan for the elimination of child labor and forced labor, which traverses 2021 to 2030. So these are very potent normative landscape which creates obligations and standards through which we can use in implementing laws against child labor. And again, with reference to the IHRDA National Action Plan research, shows how states are attempting and largely failing to translate these norms into actionable policy through the National Action Plan on business and human rights. So we have the laws. We are not saying there are no laws, but how are they implementing these laws is what remains to be seen. So we are, like I said, we have some emerging mandatory measures. We have the EU corporate sustainability due diligence, the France's duty of vigilance laws, the German supply chain act, of course, which, like I said, they draw significant inspiration from the UNGPs. So in terms of corporate supply chains, what are the visible issues or crises that we see? And again, how do we tie this to the corporate nexus? Because it's one thing to have, child labor, which is not tied to corporate activities, but because a conversation is geared towards corporate responsibility. If you don't mind, could you please mute your mics? So in terms of child labor in corporate supply chains, what I want to do is to tie the corporate nexus. Again, I make reference to the DRC because a very classical and obvious example, which we see numerous examples across Africa. In the DRC, for example, which is the most powerful contemporary illustration, we see children as young as 6 to 7 mining cobalt, right, which are sold to manufacturers of electric vehicles and smartphones. We probably all use smartphones today, right? And so some of us also drive electric vehicles. Do we pause to think how the raw materials that produce these materials we're using, how are they sourced? Right? Are we feeding off the bloods of young adults or even children in the process? And what are we doing? Are we helpless? Right? So this is the contradiction at the heart of corporate human rights claim. If we look at agriculture, cocoa, cotton, tobacco, child labor is embedded in smallholder supply chains, and they're feeding global brands with multi-billion-dollar revenues, right? And the same experience also in the East and Southern Africa. These are not legacy industries. They generate billions in annual revenues. And domestic work is structurally invisible. These are excluded from most labor law protections. They are rarely audited. These works are rarely audited because even the labor inspectors, if they announce they're going to inspect, they quickly hide these children, or they even tell them to go on vacation so that they are not seen on whichever plantation that they are in. So the purchasing practices of this group of brands, they're very aggressive. And it's not just individual bad actors. They create a structural conditions for child labor. There's a price pressure issue, and there's a shortened lead time, which force suppliers to minimize costs. And children are the cheapest available labor for them, right? And under the UNGPs, like I mentioned in the last previous slides, the key distinction is between causing, contributing to, and be directly linked to abuses. So who is causing child labor issues? Who is contributing to this? And how is it being directly linked to abuses? And we see that businesses are implicated in all of these three strands. Because most multinational corporations that are sourcing from high-risk regions are at the minimum directly linked to child labor. And many of them actively contribute through their procurement practices, through their sourcing practices, and they turn a blind eye to the result of their monstrous activities. So the reason, like I mentioned, the laws that we continue to have today, for some reasons, which it's very hard for me to fathom, is that children are really centered in these conversations. Most human rights due diligence laws really centers children. they are buried in generic vulnerable groups language. When you say vulnerable group, women, children, elderly, but there's no explicit or specific mention of children in some of these documents. And again, voluntary audits are routinely manipulated. Children are hidden from inspectors. So this is the crisis that we have, how companies are linked, very aggressive, very monstrous, prefer to go to cheap labor, and we are going to get this cheap labor in continent like Africa and from children. So how do we mainstream? How do we make visible children's rights in some of these normative regulations, whether in national action plans on business and human rights, or even in human rights due diligence laws? One of the areas which, with specific reference to the research which was done, which IHRD did, in mainstreaming children's rights in NAPS on business and human rights, is to look at limited child-specific content. Most African NAPs that we have, the 5 of them, address child labor only in general terms, right? There's a dedicated child-sensitive provisions remain the exception rather than the rule. Right. So the findings from this research was sobering, and I enjoin those of you who have not read the research to please read the summary of the findings, the recommendations, which I believe is widely available online. The findings were sobering, right? While there is increasing recognition of business and human rights at the national level, children's rights, child labor in particular, remain inadequately mainstreamed into these frameworks. The NAPs, as we've seen, they tend to be, aspirational, without specificity that is needed to drive the change in business practices. So it's a challenge for us, and hopefully we will continue these conversations. We continue to get a robust engagement with government, policymakers, civil society organizations that will realize that there's a need for us to step up our game in protecting children from harmful activities of corporate practices. So these are some of the results and findings which in the research. There's a weak enforcement architecture. There's a missing due diligence requirements, and also we had remedy gaps. Access to effective remedies for child victims of corporate-related rights violations is rarely addressed, and the existing mechanisms overwhelmingly inaccessible to children. So the accountability gap is, and which links to why existing frameworks fall short, is because there's a weak state enforcement, right? These 6 points which I highlighted in the slides, they are mutually reinforcing. So weakness in one area compounds failures in the others. If there's a weak state enforcement, there's going to be corporate reluctance to enforce the law, right? If you look at gap 4, for example, children invisible in NAPs, this directly grounded in the research, and like I said, children are rarely named as specific rights holders, right, in national plans on business and human rights, which is a critical governance failure, right? If government cannot really name children as being a key stakeholder, what are they going to enforce? If they're going to send labor inspectors to look at businesses, corporate activities, to see whether they are implicating child labor, what yardstick, what guardrails are they going to give those labor inspectors when they don't even have the rules and the laws that would guide these inspectors in carrying out their work? Barriers to remedy, right, is one of the most consequential in practice. So even where child labor is documented and the liability is clear, children and communities face near insurmountable obstacles to justice. There's the issue of forum non-convenience, there's the issue of corporate veil, there's the issue of standing. You have to have standing for you to be able to bring an action. And of course, we do know the prohibitive costs of litigation, right? Even if both at the national level, at the regional level, and even at the continental level in Arusha, unless you have pro bono cases, it's significantly very difficult to prosecute some of these problems. So weak state enforcement, for example, it's not just a capacity problem. It is political will. It's an economy problem. right? Political economy. Governments are competing for foreign investments, foreign direct investments. They are often reluctant to enforce standards that they think might deter corporations. And because of this, the huge revenue of these corporations, if governments think that if raise human rights laws, these corporations will just pack up their bags and leave, right? And once you think about it in terms of these corporate entities don't do half of what they do in Africa, where they are domesticated, their headquarters, it begins to generate a kind of, thinking about how can Africa come as a continent and rein in on these multinational corporations that are not even present here in Africa. They are not even domesticated or headquartered or domiciled in Africa. So very briefly, I'll just move to child-sensitive human rights diligence because that's what I believe is the main, the critical focus of my remarks and what I believe African governments should be focusing on. The child-sensitive human rights due diligence. What does it mean? What do I mean by child-sensitive human rights due diligence? What I mean is that companies, especially child-sensitive human rights due diligence, goes beyond just checking a box or a supplier code of conduct. Literally, all companies have these codes of conduct. What I'm talking about is a requirement on the part of companies to actively understand how their business activities and relationships specifically affect children, right? They are not just smaller audits. Children have vulnerabilities. They are still developing physically and cognitively. They have reduced capacity to advocate for themselves. And many of them are not yet visible in formal systems. So that is why a huge percentage of responsibility relies on corporations engaging with children and families, not just with adult workers or community representatives. And what I also mean is that it requires addressing the systemic factors, which includes poverty, lack of schooling, adult unemployment that make child labor rational for families. So this is more like a 5-step. This is, this is an inexhaustive list, but I believe it would significantly address the issue of child labor in Africa. First of all, the first step is that identify a map. Risk mapping must extend beyond just, supply chain suppliers to informal and subcontracted layers. We can talk the whole day about the informal sector in Africa, how it's like, of course, it's largely unregulated. That's why it's informal, and where child labor is significantly implicated. So companies must have on-the-ground assessment, not just a desk-based review. It must be like in research, we refer to as empirical research. They must have an on-the-ground assessment of how their activities are impacting child labor. The next step is to assess the impact. And these, we have a number of UNICEF as an organization, they've had these standards and benchmark to conduct child rights impact assessments, meaningfully consult affected communities and families, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights as well. They have a rigorous methodology where companies can utilize to be able to assess how they're impacting their local communities. The child in context principle mentioned there requires understanding the child's full situation. Full situation means the education, family economics, and community dynamics, right? What role is the child within the family nexus? And then the community as well. How does the community respond to child labor in a particular context? And once they conduct this research, it shouldn't just sit down at the table, right? They must be able to act and integrate the findings. And how do they do this? Prohibition of child labor must be embedded in contracts. Any kind of contracts they are doing, whether in supply chain, whether it's direct with government, whether it's direct MOUs with local communities. Prohibition of child labor must be embedded in those contracts with real consequences. So it's not just having code of conduct, that which we all know they are rarely enforced. And after this, the next stage is to track and verify right? Self-reporting by suppliers is fundamentally inadequate. You can't just rely on suppliers to self-report. Self-report is good. They should have that opportunity, but because of the nature of some of these sectors, for example, corporations should be able to track and verify whatever is being reported. And where there are instances of child labor, there must be immediate remediation, right? That's why it's referred to as prevent.
Fabian, I think we've exhausted your time. If you could wrap up.
Okay, I'll
Please.
just wrap up in 2 minutes and then remediate, right? And the only way you can remediate is, you provide child accessible grievance. So, like I said, we have, a lot of issues with the current negotiations. The Business and Human Rights Treaty is currently ongoing, which, like I said, being involved in the process, it's rarely talks about, child rights, which I believe is a very, very big issue. So what I think I will just do is just go to what I think can be done to prevent or mitigate on the part of states. I believe states should enact mandatory human rights laws. I want to be clear here that addressing child labor is not a technical problem with a technical fix. It requires a lot of fundamental structural change. Adequate wages for adults, not even adequate wages. Not only must you pay minimum wages, you must pay living wages, right? Quality education for children, functioning social protection systems, genuine corporate accountability, and must be guaranteed. So all actors must work together: states, corporations, civil society, regional bodies. They must come together to ensure that child labor is completely eradicated and even prevented in any particular setting. If we can guarantee these, I believe we will have a robust business operating in Africa in whatever sectors where communities own the project, whatever project it is that they are doing, and we will definitely be able to say that Africa has gone a step further in eradicating child labor in pretty much all sectors of our economy. I'm going to stop here. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to deliver these remarks. And I look forward to more engaging conversation around this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abe. That was indeed very insightful. You'll have more time during the panel discussion to deliberate more on your findings in the report. But for now, I will hand over to my co-moderator for today, my colleague Awa, who will moderate the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone. Also, thank you once again, Dr. Abe, for that presentation. So I will be taking you through this segment of the discussion, which is an expert dialogue on prevention and accountability, strengthening corporate responsibility and child protection systems to eliminate child labor. I know Dr. Abe has already been introduced by my colleague, Maria Sen, so I will take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Shimelis Segai, who is the Director of Programs at Africa Child Policy Forum, responsible for managing the forum's program-related activities. He's currently a member of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child's Working Group on Children with Disabilities and has represented ACPF in numerous global, Pan-African, and national forums, making substantive contributions to setting the continent's child rights agenda on topics of critical importance. And another expert that will be joining us for this discussion is Dr. Chairman Okolois, who is an expert in the African and international human rights systems. He currently serves as an external expert to the Working Group on Children's Rights and Business within the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and is also a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Jurisprudence, College of Law at the University of South Africa. Dr. Shimelis and Dr. Chairman, thank you very much for joining us today. So to start us off for this segment, would really love to hear your insights on this particular question, which would be directed to all three of you. That is Dr. Shimelis, Dr. Chairman, as well as Dr. Ade. So we know that child labor remains a widespread issue across Africa, despite legal prohibitions, as well as policy commitments that we've seen at national, regional, and international levels. We want to know from your perspective, why does child labor persist, and also what are the most significant challenges to its elimination? Thank you very much. So perhaps we can start with Dr. Shimelis, if that's okay, and then Dr. Chairman and Dr. Ade can come. Would be great if we can keep the interventions to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Awa. Thank you for also for giving us the opportunity to intervene in this important webinar. Thank you for Mike and Mari as well. Yeah, I will be very brief. I think in terms of what you just said and also what Dr. Abe presented earlier, I mean, a lot has been happening in the continent in terms of legislative frameworks and policy frameworks, national action plans, etc., etc. But child labor has still persisted. And in fact, in terms of absolute numbers, it has increased, even though in terms of percentage, it has declined over the last 20 years. So frankly, there are a number of structural issues that we can talk about. But for the interest of time, I'll focus only on a few. First of all, there is this near total absence of preventative measures in addressing child labor in the continent. Really, most of the efforts are reactive and curative and response-oriented. And why is that the case? That's the case because prevention is always costly, very complex in terms of programming. It also requires really revamping your child protection infrastructure. So it might also upset, the interest of global corporate actors. I mean, there are so many factors that play into this. So we seem to focus more on response, legislative instruments, which is not bad in its own right, but it's important to address the underlying root causes of child labor. That's one important factor that really is at play in terms of why child labor is persisting. Secondly is, of course, the most common issue is lack of institutional capacity. We know that most of the laws, even if they are colorful, are seldom implemented and enforced because of lack of capacity. Governments seldom allocate resources. Most of child protection programming is done by non-governmental organizations. And because of that, it's not sustainable, really. And so the lack of proper infrastructure, sufficient capacity in terms of human resources and budgets is also a very important factor as to why child labor has still persisted. But there is also really the absence of support to victims. This is often neglected in current discourse and current discussions, but seldom really we rush to rescue children from harmful child labor practices, and yet these children are not given the necessary support after they are rescued. And that's important because if a child is not given the necessary support in terms of rehabilitation, economic support, and educational support, and even medical screening support, other children will see it as something that you shouldn't be involved in. In other words, rescue becomes something that communities avoid and governments avoid, experts avoid. So that's the other factor. But the other thing is really the lack of relevance of the education system has also played a role, really. Our education systems lack local meaning of relevance, especially when it comes to economic survival, economic sustenance. That is a factor. Really parents make that rational choice of sending their children to work and learn some practical skills for economic survival if the education system is not responding to their local needs. So that is also a very important factor, but is seldom, like I said earlier, seldom addressed in current discussions. Lack of awareness has been a very important factor. I mean, this is no matter how generous you are in giving families and parents with cash transfers, if they are not convinced that there is short-term and long-term harmful impact of child labor, they will continue sending their children to work. So awareness creation also becomes important. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Chairman?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to join you to commemorate the World Day on Child Labor, which actually was celebrated on the 12th of June. So my response to the question, and I really like the context that has been set by Professor Nee, and of course the intervention by Shimelis. And just to add that poverty is one very important factor that has, allowed child labor to persist. As you know, Africa is currently considered to be the poverty capital of the world, and many sub-Saharan African countries still linger behind in terms of socio-economic development. And as such, many families see children, as the necessary tools for actually addressing the economic inequalities or challenges that they face, through child hawking, child exploitation, child labor, and what have you. And so that is one challenge that has persisted, and of course that fits very nicely into the context or the response from Shemilis in terms of the institutional lapses in addressing this, either through education to the public, to parents, and of course providing the necessary budgetary support to families that are struggling. And so from a point of view of why it persists, I would say that poverty is a key driver. And the greatest challenge to its elimination is not only a lack of political will, it is the fact that many African countries do not yet have the capacity to eliminate poverty. And for those that have the capacity or the resources, they're struggling with issues such as corruption, economic inequality, and a lack of purposeful development. Countries like Nigeria, that's considered to be resource rich, but continue to struggle in terms of socioeconomic development. So that would be one key factor for me. The other important factor as to why child labor lingers would be a lack of regulatory oversight. If you go to many African capitals, maybe African cities, they don't have to be capitals, you will see that child hawking is quite prevalent. And then you have, child protection officers, you have sometimes dedicated child ministry or child welfare ministry that are aware of this, child labor on major roads in many African cities, and nothing is done about it. So there is that regulatory oversight gap, which still needs to be filled. And I think we can tie the lack of budget, as Shemilis has said, to the implementation of this particular responsibility on the part of government. But those are my take on this particular thing. And to address them would be one, governments actually, trying to give more attention to the harm that children face. We consider children to be the future of tomorrow, to be future leaders of the continent. So we have to begin to make the necessary investments in schools, in ensuring that children are taken away from the streets, in also providing social interventions for parents so that they do not have to rely on their children, and also enact laws, that impose responsibilities for, child abuse and all of that. So I think those would be some of the ways that we can actually address the menace of child labor on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chairman. Dr. Abe, would you like to chip in perhaps for 2 minutes?
Yeah, well, 2 minutes. What more can I add to what has been said? It's a failure of the system, right? It's a failure of the institutions to respond to these important something that is human, not just about right. It's something that is human, and the measure of our commitment to human rights, to children's rights. I mean, it's not found in conventions we ratify. It's not. Yeah, we have regulations, we have conventions, we have laws, but it's in the measure of our commitment is in terms of the accountability we demand of every corporation. So be it in supply chain on every continent. So if every child works instead of learning, that represents a failure of our system. And it's a test of a collective result. So yes, we do have poverty. We do have, lack of payment of minimum wage, living wage or minimum wage. But corporations have this heightened responsibility to ensure that no child is used in any form or fashion in the process towards realizing their profit. So yes, governments have a responsibility to take because they are DTBRS. They make the laws, corporations are meant to respond to the laws, but corporations now are getting to that stage where they have a heightened responsibility to cover the gap, so that in settings where the laws are not even there or clear, they by themselves should be able to self-manage their own responsibility. So I believe with so much activist forces, so conversations like these would create an avenue to respond to how why child labor persists, and and also resolve whatever structural drivers that may continue to place the children at risk. Maybe naming and shaming could be one avenue for companies that engage in these. But again, like I said, companies are getting crafty in terms of labor inspection. If a labor inspector goes to a company and then doesn't see children because they've been hidden or they've been crafty about it, then there wouldn't be that report. But we all know that children are being utilized in this, in these settings. Cheap labor, poverty, these are some of the root causes, and I hope government would respond to some of these issues speedily.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abe. I think the next question would be for Dr. Shimelis. So much of the discourse on child labor focuses on response and remediation. Why is prevention often overlooked, and what preventive measures should states prioritize to stop children from child labor in the first place? Thank you very much. Please, yes, let's try as much as possible to keep the interventions to 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you.
I will. Thank you. It's a $1 million question, but I'll try to be brief. Yeah. So no, the question: why is prevention neglected in current discussions and programming? First of all, like I said earlier, prevention is very, very expensive and very costly, and preventive programming is also very complex. And its implementation requires an effective collaboration. It requires revamping your institutional infrastructure. It also requires long-term political and funding commitments, which most governments may not be able to do, or maybe unable, or maybe unwilling to do. So that's really one reason. But like I said also earlier, I hinted at earlier, usually most of our child programming is curative and response-oriented. Really, that's the mindset. It's a mindset that persisted for more than 20, 30 years now within the child protection sphere. So prevention, despite the fact that prevention can be more effective, more efficient in terms of addressing child labor in the long run, in the short term, it's very expensive, very costly. It requires a lot of human resources. It requires a lot of revamping your institutional infrastructure. It requires also skills, really, and also bringing together the different sectors that deal with prevention. So I think that's one. But the other issue is really, if you, for instance, if you eliminate child labor altogether, like Dr. Abi earlier mentioned, there are global actors within the system, the supply chain, that may be upset. I mean, the system may, your intervention may somehow upset the interest of so many powerful economic actors, because their survival, their economic survival depends on the exploitative labor of children in Africa, whether it's in the chocolate industry or in fashion or in other in the industry. So I think for those and other reasons, prevention has not been prioritized by governments. Partly also, to be honest with you, for practical reasons, because most governments are poor. You know that child labor is very high in low-income countries. There is only 1% of children that are in labor in high-income countries. So it requires resources, and because of maybe legitimately for lack of resources, governments may not prioritize prevention. But there are other factors that I mentioned, structural factors, that contribute to the neglect of prevention. But it's important, like previous speakers said, prevention should be prioritized in future programming, not just response and curative programming. Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Shimelis. Building on that and also drawing from recent research on children in the informal economy, what are the key structural drivers that place children at risk of child labor, and how can governments better address these vulnerabilities?
You want me to intervene?
Building on your response,
yes.
of what the states should prioritize to stop children from child labor in the first place, and also looking at recent research on children in the informal economy, what are the key structural drivers that place children at risk of child labor, and how can governments better address these vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think we all agree that poverty is really the single most important driver of child labor, household poverty. So really eliminating household and child poverty would go a long way in terms of addressing child labor. How do you do that? You can use social protection programs that has been mentioned by Dr. Abe and also by Chairman. It's important to put in place child-sensitive social protection programs with some soft conditionalities in terms of child labor. If you can't simply give away money and then still parents continue to send their children to work. So I think that is really one important step that we can take. School feeding programs, as been mentioned by others. I think perhaps for me as a chair advocate, school feeding programs are the single most important measure taken within this sector over the last how many years, so many years. It's one of the most effective measures that can really cut across different challenges. There is also credible evidence that in countries where there is robust school feeding programs, there has been a significant decline in child labor. So that's the other one. Of course, like Dr. Abi earlier said, you can also put in place macro level economic measures like, really employment generation for parents, using poor economic policies, etc. Really coming up with a proper equitable distribution of national resources. Some of these will contribute to uplift for households, and there is no parent really, frankly, that would send his or her child to work in toxic hazard situations if resources were available for that household, frankly. So it's at the end of the day, everything boils down to poverty and deprivation. So it's important governments take that very seriously. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those very, very insightful responses on how to prevent child labor. So we're now going to proceed to ask some questions to Dr. Abe regarding business accountability and corporate accountability. So the first question is in relation to how businesses are increasingly expected to identify and address child labor risk within operations and supply chains. So what practical responsibilities, Dr. Abe, should businesses be taking to prevent child labor?
Yes, thank you very much, Awa. So the UNGPs are clear on such practical responsibilities. There's a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which requires ongoing, proactive, and context-sensitive action. Right, ongoing must be proactive. It must be context sensitive. So how you address child labor in mining is obviously going to be different from how, as a company, how you address child labor in construction or in extractive industries. So for me, I think there are just a couple of steps. Number one, it's corporations, businesses must know their supply chain genuinely, right? And this is the first and most fundamental responsibility, supply chain transparency. Right. So for you to do this, you must have to invest in supply chain traceability. You must be able to trace the supply chain to be able to guarantee that your suppliers are not, involved in child labor. Engage local partners with community knowledge, and you move away from the fiction that not knowing, I'm not aware about risks in the chain constitutes due diligence. Secondly, you have to be able to tackle the root cause. One of the root causes, which I think is lack of, again, which I keep referring to, is a lack of paying living and minimum wage, because child labor, and all the panelists have mentioned, child labor is overwhelmingly driven by household poverty, right? So when parents earn enough money to sustain their families, children can go to school rather than go to work. So this means that companies must examine whether their purchasing prices, their payment timelines, their contracting terms, create the economic conditions in which child labor, does not even flourish, right? And again, thirdly, I think there should be support access to education. Even though, as we know, most governments have, they have this policy of free education, but we do know that the governments don't provide don't provide uniforms, don't provide textbooks, don't provide, transportation for students. And these largely, some parents may not be able to afford this, especially where the parents are working and they're not, getting living wages or even minimum wage. age. So businesses, again, may have to partner with governments or with NGOs on school construction, bursary schemes, school feeding programs, or, flexible learning calendars that would accommodate those agricultural seasons. And they should not see this as a philanthropy. It's a basic necessity. It's a part of a coherent strategy to address that conditions that produce, child labor. They must also engage communities, not just suppliers. So it's not just dealing with suppliers. So there's something we call the social license to operate. They have the legal license to operate, which is a license obtained by government, but they need a social license to operate from the local communities, right? So you can't just address child labor through contracts alone. You must engage directly with communities from where you source your products, parents, local leaders, teachers, and even children themselves, right? So just because they're young does not mean they don't have an opinion by themselves. If you leave it to labor inspectors, social audits, they fail to detect some of these child labor practices because children, like I said, children may be hidden from inspectors or moved temporarily during inspections. So you have to have ongoing engagement with suppliers, worker representations, community schools, and local authorities. And I think, like Shimali said, responsible remediation. Remediation must be part of that practical responsibility of businesses. And finally, we have to be able to integrate child rights in corporate governance, right? The King's Code in South Africa and different corporate governance in most countries must integrate child rights in these documents to show that it's not just an option, it is a necessity for companies.
Yes, I think that also begs the question as to what child-sensitive human rights due diligence looks like in practice, and particularly in sectors that you've mentioned. So we would love for you to really shed more light on what that looks like in these sectors, because we do know that the risks are really high for children. So what does child-sensitive human rights due diligence look like in practice?
Yeah, so this is one of the most important questions for businesses, right? To grapple serious human rights due diligence. And as articulated in the UNGPs, and now, like I said, it's now operationalized in mandatory legislation so that the EU, CSDDD, the French did, the France, Germany, Norway, and all countries globally are coming up with these human rights due diligence, which in some of them, children are mentioned, but largely, child rights are rarely left out. But at least we have these due diligence laws which could actually implicate child labor. So what child-sensitive human rights due diligence look like in practice is, again, tied to the first question. How do companies identify and assess child labor risks, right? So to identify child labor risks, you have to be able to disaggregate risk data by age and gender. So not just by workplace, but by supply chain mode, the geography, the season, and then you have to commission child rights impact assessments. You just have to do that. How is your, based on some thresholds or methodology or indicators, how are your activities impacting children in whatever sectors that you're working, especially in high-risk sourcing context, extractive industries, mining, oil and gas? How are your activities impacting children? Of course, you have to involve child rights specialists. Again, engage with local civil society organizations, the teachers, the health workers, the community leaders who have direct knowledge of child labor in that area. And you also be able to account for seasonality, right? Child labor in agriculture often spikes, during harvest periods that may not coincide with other cycles. Like I said, conducting child labor in mining is different from child labor in agriculture, right? Again, prevent and mitigate. The UNGP talks about you have to be able to prevent, and where in the best of intentions, child labor does occur, you have to be able to mitigate. And it's not just by codes of conduct, right? Codes of conduct are very, very ineffective in prohibiting child labor. You have to be able to come up with partner again with governments and international organizations, provide suppliers with capacity building support on child rights standard, child sensitive grievance mechanisms, and age verification system. And again, like I said in my opening remarks, it must be able to track and verify with independent child-sensitive eyes. Suppliers cannot self-verify. Verification must go beyond the standard social audit. It's not just a tick box approach. And engage in unannounced spot checks to some of these suppliers or companies, particularly during peak agricultural seasons, right? You just go there unannounced. Companies can just go there unannounced and check whether they're actually complying. Because if you make an announcement, they may, take advantage of that announcement and hide a lot of activities. Technology would be helpful in terms of traceability, of sourcing, blockchain-enabled supply chain tools, even the use of satellite monitoring. We have drones right now that could be helpful in ensuring that children are not using some of these plantation. And finally, you have to be able to provide access to remedy in the event, that you prevent, you mitigate, yet child labor still occurs. You have to be able to establish and support. The UNGP talks about operational level grievance mechanisms that are explicitly child accessible, use simple language, offer anonymous reporting options, because when people know that the report, there might be attack on them, they will not be able to report. So you have to be able to create that anonymous channels and then community intermediaries as well. So I believe these steps would significantly help in ensuring child-sensitive human rights due diligence approaches. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Also very, very insightful. Thank you, Dr. Abe. I think that takes us to the question on accountability and child rights protection, which I would like to direct to Dr. Chairman Okolois. So from a child rights perspective, would like to know how states strengthen accountability mechanisms to ensure that businesses respect children's rights and are held responsible where violations occur. Dr. Chairman?
Thank you very much, Awa. So how can states actually ensure that businesses respect human rights and hold them accountable where there's child rights violations? I think it's basically recognizing the ability or the power of the states to impose obligations in national legislation. That for me would be the starting point. If you do not recognize the obligations of states, of businesses to be liable for children's rights violations, then there will be no accountability. It's as easy as that. Without obligations, there can be no accountability. Another thing would be for states, besides enactment or recognition of the obligations of businesses in national legislation, would be to, ensure or strengthen regulations and enforcement. So we talked about, Unia just talked about spot checks. You need enforcement officers for that. But first of all, you need a legal framework that enables officers to do that. And then another thing would be, because the African economy, at least for most African countries, remain largely informal. You will see the resolution 21 of the African Children's Committee on protecting children's rights within the context of the informal sector. There will be a need for states to take action against, businesses that are benefiting from the unregulated sphere of the informal sector. So they have to do this, or they can do this by imposing liability, across value chains. So like Nii has said, if there are some instances where businesses might not directly employ children, but they can benefit from businesses or supply chains that actually use child labor. So there has to be a form of imposition of liability that's, on product supply chains or manufacturing sourcing, so that whenever you have children linked to supply chains, businesses should be the first line of accountability by them taking action to scrutinize their supply chain relationships. I also think that states, because of their power and regulatory capacity, can also enhance monitoring, data collection, and reporting. States are already doing this largely through their statistics bodies, They're also doing that through the reporting that they do to international treaty bodies or regional treaty bodies like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And so we can tap into this in the ability of the states to use this regulatory or oversight function over all activities within their territories, to impose obligations, to ensure enforcement, to ensure compliance, and to impose penalties where necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Chairman. I know you do engage a lot with the regional mechanisms, and would really be good to know what role regional human rights mechanisms, including the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, play in advancing protection against child labor. If you could shed more light on that, would be grateful. Thank you.
Okay, so what role does regional mechanisms like the African Children's Committee and other mechanisms play, to address the challenge of child labor? I would say basically, I like to see regional mechanisms like the African Children's Committee as a concentric circle at a regional level to address, issues that are of a transboundary nature. And the challenge of child labor is not, peculiar to just the territory of one particular country. So regional bodies are well placed to address it from a regional perspective. They can also help address the limits of one particular state over transboundary issues, and of which child labor, child trafficking, child pornography are all transboundary because of their technological or complex nature. But most importantly is their ability to develop norms. So, at the African Committee level, they're able to adopt general comments. They're able to, adopt declarations. They're able to adopt resolutions. Also, as a body of the African Union, they can work with the African Union to develop a treaty. Even though they are a result of the development of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, but they can actually contribute to development of other treaties that actually address the crisis of child labor. Importantly, too, is their ability to interpret. Because of their quasi-judicial or judicial nature, they have an ability to interpret international treaties or regional norms in relation to child labor on the continent. And the African Children's Committee in particular has been doing this through its interpretative authority in handling, complaints or in adopting general comments, that expatiate, give authoritative explanations on the provisions of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Another way that they can actually advance corporate accountability for child labor within the African context will be their monitoring and reporting roles. Like, under the African Children's Charter, state parties to the charter do submit periodic reports, so they can use that mechanism to monitor compliance, and they can use it to influence states to better regulate the activities of corporations by demanding reports. So I like to say that I like to put it this way, when the committee demand reports in relation to child labor, states have now a greater burden to begin to track the activities, whether formal or informal, of businesses in this particular domain. Also, the complaints mechanism, especially the contentious process of the African Children's Committee through handling communications submitted to it, is also an avenue for advancing accountability. But I should mention that at the time of the adoption of the African Children's Charter, businesses were not considered to be direct subjects, of the work of the African Children's Committee, but however, they considered to be indirect subjects. So they're not off the hook in terms of the power and authority of the African Children's Committee. And maybe lastly would be the ability of regional mechanisms like the African Children's Committee, the African Commission, to investigate, and conduct fact-finding missions. So they can also use that to influence the ability of states to better regulate and ensure that child labor challenges are addressed domestically.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chairman. This has been very, very insightful. We've heard from Dr. Shimelis on prevention of child labor. We've also heard from Dr. Abe on business accountability as well as corporate responsibility, and also heard from Dr. Chairman with respect to accountability and child rights protection. And I really like that you shed more light on the role of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. I think at this juncture, I would invite my co-moderator, Maria, to take it up from here in terms of the next segment, the next engagement that we'll be having with the panelists. Thank you very much for the very insightful responses.
Thank you very much, Awa, for a well-coordinated panel discussion. Maybe just before we open the platform for participants to ask questions or make comments, I would just like to ask the panelists, what key message would you like policymakers, civil society, and young people generally to take away from today's discussion? We can start with Dr. Shimelis.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think, first of all, it's important to rescue children that are already in child labor. I think that should be the first priority, because there are, close to 90 million children that are in hazardous and toxic environments, working under very exploitative circumstances. So rescuing them becomes important, but it doesn't suffice. It has to be followed through by rehabilitative support, income support, taking them back to school, and other providing them with the necessary opportunities so that they can be sustained. So that's really the first important message: rescuing them, children that are already in child labor. Second is really criminalizing child labor simply without providing the necessary economic and social support to families doesn't work. You know what it does? It simply metamorphoses child labor into child slavery and child trafficking. It drives child labor in underground and to have far more dire, consequences than child labor itself. So it's important to use legislative instruments to ban and prevent and prohibit child labor, but that has to be complemented by socio-economic measures that support families to be economically self-reliant. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shimelis. Dr. Abe?
I think just to re-echo what Shimali said, and just to add a bit for I think what the onus is on the states, right, to ensure that they prohibit child labor, whether as a criminal issue or in whatever way, form, or fashion. But what I would add is I think there should be a significant investment in the labor inspection systems. The ILO recommends one inspector per 10,000 workers, and many African countries are below this threshold. And they must also extend this inspection mandates to cover the agricultural and informal sectors where the child labor is prevalent, and with the informal sector is, of course, the largest sector, of course, in Africa. For businesses, I just want to be direct about something that is often left unsaid. Children's rights are not a business case; they are rights. And the elimination of child labor is required of businesses, not because it improves their brand value or whether it reduces regulatory risk, but because no child should be denied education, safety, and dignity in order for a company to generate profit. So we have to begin to emphasize that before businesses, that if it's going to involve significant amount of money, then so be it. You just must ensure that children are not used, being vulnerable members of the society. And and I also want to note that the civil societies also have a role to play, including, of course, IHRDA. You are the watchdog, the advocate, the bridge. Whether in monitoring, in research, in litigation, in building the evidence base on children's rights, this work is irreplaceable. And I think we have to begin to engage, to discuss, to heighten our role in civil society, pursue strategic litigation where it is possible, not only as a remedy for individual cases, but as a mechanism for generating precedents that will reshape, corporate conduct across sectors. I remember a few years ago, had an interaction with the Registrar of the African Court as to why most companies are not sued, are not brought before regional courts, where we don't have cases, precedents, like we have in the African Commission cases. And the registrar told me that, well, it's because nobody has brought such cases before the court, right? I know there's this debate about, subjects of international law, but we should test the boundaries of the law as civil societies. I believe what is needed now is political will, the corporate accountability, sustained civil society advocacy, and a meaningful participation of children and young people themselves in this narrative would ensure that child labor is eradicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chairman?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to stand on the authority of the responses of the previous speakers, and just to add that advancing children's rights in order to address child labor risks really is not a favor being done to children. It's an obligation that states have to protect the rights of children who are going to be the future leaders of tomorrow. And so imposing, business requirements, to comply with child rights, expectations on international standards or under regional standards is not extraordinary. It's just the states, imposing that obligation to promote responsible business conduct within the country. And so one thing I would like policymakers, states to take, state representatives and bodies to take from this particular convening is that they should work actively to at least infuse obligations that require businesses, one, to undertake mandatory child rights due diligence. So if you want to say mandatory human rights due diligence with a child rights approach, that is totally fine. Secondly would be to include children in the entire policy development process or legal development process. Nothing about children should be without children. And I know that in many African countries now, you do have children parliaments where they're able to actually participate in the governance of the country. And so we can leverage on the existence of these children's forums, to contribute to national, legal, legislative, and policy development. And then the last thing I would like policymakers and key stakeholders to take from this meeting is the need to collaborate with civil society actors, children's rights defenders in the national environment, and also with the African Children's Committee. And these particular bodies can work with government, one, to capacitate them on understanding the risks that are posed to children, can also help policymakers better understand the challenges that children face and the need to better engage the responsibilities of businesses towards child labor issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, for those deliberations. And I think we can open the platform now for questions from participants. Awa, I think we already have a few on the chat box.
Yes, I think I see a question from Alet. So she's saying that in conflict zones such as the east of DRC, for instance, where armed groups chains are controlled by armed groups. So she said her question is addressed to Dr. Abe and the other panelists, if the time permits. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll go for it. Thank you, Alet, for the question. That's kind of very interesting question. I don't know if you've met at a particular forum or event where this kind of issue was discussed. This is a conversation I've had in numerous different fora, and it's part of the working conversations we're currently having. We're negotiating the binding treaty on business and human rights. And as you know, the debate has always been multinational corporations cannot be sued under international law. And you can only state as subjects of the Westphalian approach, the states as subject of international law. And the question I keep asking in some of this forum many years ago, we just started this conversation, is I keep using the example of DRC, which is quite a sorry A state it's a country which have done significant research on, done empirical research, and visited a number of times. And if we look at the Katanga province, right, and again, like you mentioned in your questions and your interventions, and we had the state has lost legitimacy in a part of the country, right? The state doesn't control that region. Guerrillas, warlords, and like you mentioned, armed groups, control that region. Now, if you sue the state of the Democratic Republic of the Congo at The Hague, and their DRC representatives gets there and says, we don't actually have control of that region. Are you really going to pay liability upon a state for losing control over this region? Or are you going to say, why, or you're going to ask the question why the state lacks legitimacy in the first place? So that issue of the DRC which you mentioned, it's one of the reasons why the UNGP says, of course, companies have heightened responsibility when they're in conflict zone, but the more important reason is why corporations should assume that role and responsibility where they can be sued and be liable under international law. So it's a sorry state of affair in the DRCs, and of course I believe it is very possible to demand accountability regarding child labor in such situations. It's money wheels the progress. You have to be able to source where the money is coming from, right? If it is the corporation, definitely these are not Congolese corporations. These are corporations that are domiciled in developed countries. It took the United States of America to actually create a law by congressional act, the SOX Act, which says that sourcing and tracing any minerals which can be sourced and traced to the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo is prohibited from being used in the production of any minerals of any electronics or technology that is going to be used in the United States. So if the United States can have such law, that because we believe that the minerals sourced from the DRC is blood minerals, we are not going to use it, or we're not going to be part of it, why can't the global community take cue from that? Right, we continue to hopefully, with the Business and Human Rights Treaty is ratified, hopefully that would create a form of liability for multinational corporations. But sadly, as of today, it's only the state that you can sue. But I believe there are other avenues through which some of these multinational corporations can be held liable for supporting these armed groups and creating an avenue where conflict reigns, and where conflict reigns is where they're able to extract so much minerals for profit maximization. I don't know if other panelists will jump in.
Anyone else wants to add to that?
And I come in.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, I think frankly, it's very difficult always to regulate non-state actors, in conflict situations, and it's been perhaps one of the loopholes in the current international human rights system and architecture. But it's always important to go back to the prevention aspect. It's important to resolve conflicts peacefully, and until you do that, perhaps children living in those situations will continue to be exploited in different ways both by armed groups and state actors. So I think that's really important. So at the end of the day, it's about peace building in those countries like the DRC. It's also important to prioritize support to those countries, because even within the state structure in conflict-affected countries, child protection systems are either totally dysfunctional or fully functional. So support through the UN system, CSO support has to prioritize countries such as the DRC that are affected by conflict, and because of that, their child protection systems are in disarray. So it's important really to prioritize that in that regard. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shimelis. I think there's another question from Abena. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or use the raise hand feature so that we're able to identify who wants to speak or ask a question. So the question says, beyond legal compliance and supply chain audits, what other interventions can businesses implement to address the structural drivers of child labor, such as poverty, limited access to education, and inadequate social protection systems? And how can the effectiveness of these preventive measures be measured over time? That's the question from Abena. Thanks, Abena. I don't know if any one of the experts would like to take a first bite at answering the question.
Yeah, I can. So quite a good number of measures that can be taken, but mostly they are state sanctioned. They could be state sanctioned. A critical example is India, for example. A few years ago, they amended their corporate law to ensure that companies devote 2% of their net revenue for the preceding past 3 years on corporate social responsibility, mandatory corporate social responsibility. I think currently the Petroleum Act in Nigeria also looks at creating a fund that would, help ensure, that the areas where those resources are obtained are actually taken care of. Now, this may not, accommodate child rights, which is what we are discussing today, but to the extent that your question is asked, interventions can businesses implement? I think the most important is operational level grievance mechanisms. How many companies have in-house remedial system where even victims can actually approach? Because it's not in all cases. Companies don't have to wait, right, till they get to the court before they now start saying, let us settle out of court. How are you able to ensure that you address the victims' concerns, in this case, children, where they're being used in the farm? Do you have such mechanisms in-house to be able to address it so that before it goes, to the formalized system? So the operational level grievance mechanisms is one of such. And another could be businesses again engaging with local communities. Most times, multinational corporations especially assume they know what local communities want. They assume they know what development is, and therefore they create such development initiatives on behalf of local communities, right? But unfortunately, local communities have a different idea about, how to address some of these things, whether it's poverty, whether it's education, whether it's even social protection systems, which is squarely the state responsibility. So businesses should be able to engage with local communities, have a conversation with them. What do you want? How do you want it? And oftentimes when that does happen, we've seen such effectiveness. GoFees is one classic example in South Africa that engage with local communities, and over time there is these corporations, cooperation between local communities and businesses, and they see whatever project on their community as joint effort rather than the arrogance of multinational companies thinking that just because they have the legal license to operate, they can do anything they want. So it's talking to the communities, engaging with parents, teachers, healthcare system about what is the best interest of the child and the young person, listening to the children as well. They have a voice, and I think Chairman mentioned that there are lots of children parliament across Africa. Businesses must engage with that platform to know, to help, and help prevent any occurrence of child labor.
Thank you, Dr. Abe. I'm not sure we have any other questions. Perhaps I can, Maria, would you like to proceed from here? I think the only one we have left is more of a comment and not a question. So,
yeah, thank you very much, Awa. I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A session. And as per the agenda, I think we're drawing close to the end. I would just like to maybe hand over to Michael to do the closing.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much, colleagues. I think you will all agree with me that this has been an excellent panel discussion, and we are grateful for the expertise of our colleagues who have generously shared their time, intellect, and years of research that they have diligently done with us. I think we have all benefited immensely from these discussions. We are grateful for all the participants who have also joined us today. And we hope that we continue to engage, collaboratively on this issue. For us at IHRD, I think our commitment is very clear that we will continue to document, to raise awareness about the issue of child labor and other child rights related concerns, to build capacity among stakeholders where capacity is required, because oftentimes we assume that the stakeholders actually appreciate the issues in significant extent, and that they actually know what the obligations are. So it's important for us to continue to build capacity of the state parties, of companies, of civil society actors who are also instruments for awareness raising, for providing direct support to children who are affected by child labor, and ensuring that collectively we are able to counter this menace of child labor, which has very detrimental consequences for the children of our continent. And if we want to have an Africa if it has a future that is bright, then we certainly need to be taking care of our children and not be exposing them to child labor and its harmful consequences. And in instances where accountability mechanisms exist, we will continue to use our capacity to hold duty bearers accountable through strategic litigation and other kinds of legal advocacy avenues, so that together we can ensure that prevention is the priority, but where prevention fails and mitigation efforts are not adequate, that accountability is ensured, and that those who violate rights actually get to pay a price for violating the rights of children across the continent. With those few remarks, colleagues, we're grateful for your participation, and let's continue to raise awareness about the impact of child labor on our children and the future that we want to build together as an African continent. We're grateful for your participation today, colleagues and panelists.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.